At 6:02 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Ensign Albert Kyle Earnest sat in the cockpit of a Grumman TBF-1 Avenger on Midway Island, watching mechanics fuel a torpedo bomber that had never seen combat. 25 years old, 0 combat hours, 0 enemy kills. Behind him in the turret sat Seaman First Class J. Manning, age 20. Below, in the ventral position, crouched Radioman Third Class Harry Ferrier, 17 years old. The Japanese had dispatched 108 aircraft to destroy Midway that morning, supported by 4 carriers and the entire combined fleet. Earnest's TBF was aircraft 8T1, Bureau number 00380, first aircraft off the Grumman production line. The TBF-1 Avenger had arrived at Pearl Harbor 6 days earlier. Earnest and 5 other pilots from Torpedo Squadron 8 had flown them to Midway 3 days ago. The rest of VT-8 was somewhere at sea aboard USS Hornet, flying the obsolete TBD Devastator. Earnest's detachment had the new plane. Bigger. Faster. Nobody knew if that would matter. Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling commanded the 6-plane detachment. At 32, the other pilots called him Old Langdon. He'd briefed them 2 days earlier. The Japanese fleet was coming. 4 carriers, battleships, cruisers, the entire Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor. Midway had 52 combat aircraft to stop them. 3 American carriers waited somewhere north. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor was next. At 5:55, a truck raced down the flight line. Marines were shouting, "Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, 150 nautical miles out. Launch everything." Earnest started his engine. The right cyclone radial roared to life. He'd never dropped a live torpedo. None of them had except Fieberling. 6 TBF Avengers lifted off Midway at 600 hours. No fighter escort. The Marine Wildcats were already scrambling to defend the island. Earnest flew behind Fieberling. Manning test-fired his turret gun. Ferrier checked his ventral gun and radio. They climbed to 8,000 feet and turned northwest. Nothing but water for 150 miles. By 1942, torpedo bombing had become a suicide mission. You had to fly low, straight, slow. The Japanese knew this. Their Zero fighters were faster than anything America had. At Coral Sea 1 month earlier, American torpedo squadrons had been slaughtered. Most torpedo bomber crews didn't survive their first attack. At 0710, Earnest saw the Japanese fleet. 4 massive carriers in formation. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and above them, black specks diving toward the 6 American planes. Zero fighters. Too many to count. Fieberling dove toward the carriers. The other 5 Avengers followed. Earnest pushed his stick forward. Manning opened fire. Ferrier was firing from below. Tracers were everywhere. The first TBF exploded in midair. The second tumbled into the sea. Then the third. Then the fourth. Earnest saw Fieberling's plane spiral down. 5 Avengers gone in less than 3 minutes. Earnest was alone. Zeros were coming from 3 directions. 20mm cannon fire punched through his windshield. Glass shrapnel hit his neck. Blood ran down inside his flight suit. His instrument panel exploded. The compass stopped working. Manning's gun went silent. Ferrier came on the intercom. Manning was hit. Bad. Maybe dead. Ferrier himself was wounded. Earnest was 200 feet above the water. He opened his bomb bay doors and released his torpedo at the nearest cruiser and missed. More cannon fire tore through the fuselage. His elevator controls went dead. The stick wouldn't respond. The Avenger should have crashed. Instead, it kept flying level. If you want to know whether Earnest survived the flight back to Midway, please hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share this story with more people. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Earnest. He was still taking fire. Bullets hitting the armor plate behind his seat. His hydraulics were shot. 1 landing gear wheel wouldn't extend. No compass, no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no radio. Manning was definitely dead. Blood everywhere in the turret. The right engine was still running, and when he adjusted his elevator trim tabs, the aircraft responded. Not much, just enough to gain altitude and turn slightly. He was controlling a 3-ton aircraft with trim tabs designed for fine adjustments. Earnest nursed the crippled TBF into a cloud bank. The zeros broke off. They assumed he was finished. He flew east by dead reckoning, following the morning sun. If he missed Midway, the next land was Pearl Harbor, 1,200 miles away. He had maybe 2 hours of fuel, one wheel, no instruments, a dead gunner, a wounded radio man, and 73 bullet holes he didn't know about yet. Earnest flew at 2,000 feet inside the cloud. The TBF shuddered with every adjustment of the trim tabs. The big Cyclone engine was running rough, but it was running. That was all that mattered. He had no way to check his fuel. The gauge was destroyed along with everything else on his instrument panel. He estimated he'd burned maybe half his fuel getting to the Japanese fleet and attacking. That left him roughly 90 minutes, maybe less. 200 miles back to Midway. He had to find it. The Pacific Ocean covered 64 million square miles. Midway Atoll was 2 square miles of coral and sand. Miss it by 5 miles and he'd never see it. He'd run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. With one wheel down, the TBF would cartwheel and break apart on impact. He and Ferrier would have maybe 30 seconds before it sank. Ferrier's voice came through the intercom. He was conscious again. He'd been knocked out by the same 20mm shell that killed Manning. Blood was running down from the turret into his position. He couldn't tell if it was Manning's blood or his own. He was wounded, but he could move. He tried to see into the bomb bay through the small window to confirm the torpedo was gone, but Manning's blood covered the glass. Earnest told Ferrier to stay on the intercom. He needed to know someone else was alive. The solitude at 2,000 feet, with a dead crewman behind him and instruments that looked like a junkyard, was making it hard to think. Ferrier acknowledged. His voice was weak, but steady. The trim tabs were designed to make tiny adjustments during level flight. Earnest was using them to control pitch and maintain altitude. When he adjusted the tab nose down, the aircraft descended. Nose up, it climbed. But the response was slow, sluggish. If he overcorrected, the TBF would enter a dive or climb he couldn't recover from. He had to think 5 seconds ahead of every adjustment. His rudder still worked. That gave him directional control. He could turn, but every turn bled off airspeed and altitude. He had to keep the turns gentle. The aircraft was barely controllable in straight flight. A hard turn would probably kill him. At 0745, he broke out of the clouds. The sun was higher now, still east. He corrected his heading slightly. Ferrier asked if they were going to make it. Earnest didn't answer. He didn't know. The flight back was taking longer than the flight out. He was flying slower, more cautious. The TBF was damaged in ways he couldn't see. Control surfaces were probably shot up. The airframe had taken dozens of hits. Something could fail at any moment. A fuel line could rupture. The engine could seize. The tail could fall off. He was flying a dying aircraft and hoping it would last 30 more minutes. At 0820, he saw smoke on the horizon. Black smoke. Midway was burning. The Japanese strike had hit the island while he was attacking their carriers. He corrected his heading toward the smoke. The island came into view 10 minutes later. Sand, buildings, runway. He'd found it. Now he had to land. On one wheel, with no hydraulics, no flaps, no speed control. The Marines on Midway had just been bombed. They'd be trigger happy. Earnest had no radio to announce his approach. He had to follow the emergency procedure for damaged aircraft, a specific flight pattern with specific turns. If he didn't execute it perfectly, the anti-aircraft guns would shoot him down half a mile from safety. And if he survived that, he still had to land a 3-ton aircraft on one wheel using only trim tabs, at 120 miles per hour, on a runway probably cratered by Japanese bombs. Earnest circled Midway at 1,500 feet. The runway was intact. The Japanese had hit fuel tanks and buildings, but missed the runway. He could see fires burning across the island. Smoke drifted south. He began the emergency approach pattern. Left turn, straight leg. Right turn, straight leg. The specific sequence that told ground forces he was friendly and damaged. Anti-aircraft gunners tracked him, but held fire. They recognized the pattern. one of their own was coming home. Earnest completed the sequence and turned onto final approach. The runway was 6,000 feet long, plenty of distance, but he had one wheel and no flaps. Normal landing speed for a TBF was 75 knots. Without flaps, he'd be coming in at over 100 knots. Fast. Very fast. He adjusted the trim tabs to descend. The nose dropped slightly. The TBF began losing altitude. 300 feet. 200. 100. The island was rushing toward him. He could see Marines running toward the runway. Ambulances. Fire trucks. They knew what was coming. 50 feet. The right main gear was down and locked. The left gear was stuck retracted. When the right wheel touched, the aircraft would pivot left and cartwheel. Standard procedure was to land as slowly as possible and try to keep the wing up as long as possible. But Earnest didn't have that option. He was coming in hot with almost no control. 20 feet. He adjusted the trim tabs to level off. The TBF settled toward the runway. The right wheel touched concrete at 0944. The aircraft bounced. Came down again. The right gear held. The left wing dropped. Earnest fought to keep it up using rudder and trim. The wingtips scraped the runway. Sparks flew. The propeller was still turning. If the left wing dug in, the aircraft would flip. The TBF slewed left. Earnest kept the rudder hard right. The tail swung around. The aircraft spun 90 degrees and stopped. Engine still running. Earnest shut it down. Silence. He sat in the cockpit for 3 seconds. He was alive. On the ground. At Midway. Marines surrounded the aircraft. Medics climbed onto the wing. They pulled open the canopy. Earnest tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work. They lifted him out. Blood covered his flight suit. His neck wound had bled for 90 minutes. He pointed to the turret. Manning was up there. They needed to get Manning. 2 medics climbed to the turret. They looked inside and climbed back down. One of them shook his head. Earnest already knew. He'd known since 0715 when Manning's gun went silent. Ferrier was pulled from the ventral position. He was conscious, wounded but walking. 17 years old, and he just survived what nobody should survive. Ground crews examined the TBF. They started counting bullet holes. 7 in the engine cowling, 15 in the fuselage, 20 in the wings, 30 in the tail section. They stopped counting at 73. 64 hits from 7.7mm machine guns, 9 hits from 20mm cannons. The elevator control cables were severed. The hydraulic lines were cut. The compass was destroyed. One propeller blade had a bullet hole through it. A photographer arrived. Bureau number 00380 needed to be documented. First TBF Avenger in combat. Only survivor of 6. Flew 200 miles with no elevator control. Landed on one wheel. The aircraft would be shipped to Pearl Harbor for examination. Engineers needed to understand how it stayed airborne. Earnest was taken to the base hospital. Doctors removed glass fragments from his neck. The wound wasn't deep, but he'd lost blood. They cleaned it and bandaged it. He'd be fine, physically. But 5 pilots were dead. Jay Manning was dead. 15 more VT-8 pilots had launched from Hornet that morning in TBD Devastators. None of them came back except Ensign George Gay, who was picked up from the ocean the next day. Torpedo Squadron 8 had sent 21 aircraft into combat on June 4th. 48 men. 3 survived. Earnest, Ferrier, Gay. 45 dead. 94% casualties. The highest loss rate of any American squadron in any single action in the entire war. And the battle wasn't over yet. American dive bombers were still attacking the Japanese carriers. The outcome of the entire Pacific War was being decided while Earnest sat in a hospital bed on Midway. By noon on June 4th, the outcome of the Battle of Midway was clear. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed aircraft. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was hit that afternoon and sank the next day. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in one day. The backbone of the Kido Butai was broken. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had made it possible. The 6 TBFs from Midway attacked first, then 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet, then torpedo planes from Enterprise in Yorktown. All 3 attacks failed to score a single torpedo hit, but they pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. They forced the carriers to maneuver constantly. They prevented the Japanese from launching their own strike. And while the Zeros were busy destroying torpedo planes at wave-top height, American dive bombers arrived at altitude unopposed. VT-8 had bought that window with blood. 45 men dead, 21 aircraft destroyed, 0 torpedo hits, but they changed the course of the war. Earnest remained in the hospital on Midway for 2 days. Admiral Chester Nimitz flew in from Pearl Harbor on June 5th to inspect the island and meet with survivors. He visited Earnest in the hospital. The admiral asked what happened. Earnest told him. The launch, the attack, Manning killed, the flight back on trim tabs alone, the landing. Nimitz listened without interrupting. When Earnest finished, the admiral was quiet for several seconds. Then, he said Earnest's return flight was an epic in combat aviation. The words weren't casual praise. Nimitz had commanded submarines in World War I. He'd seen combat. He knew what was routine and what was extraordinary. Flying 200 miles with no elevator control and landing on one wheel was extraordinary. 2 weeks later, the Navy announced Earnest would receive 2 Navy Crosses for June 4th. The first for pressing home his attack against overwhelming opposition. The second for bringing his aircraft and crew back to Midway. 2 Navy Crosses in 1 day for 1 mission. Almost unprecedented. The citations were approved before the damaged TBF had even reached Pearl Harbor for inspection. Ferrier also received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart. He'd been wounded but stayed conscious. He'd helped Earnest by confirming systems and providing whatever information he could from his position. 17 years old and decorated for valor. But the awards meant little compared to the losses. Lieutenant Fieberling was dead. The 5 other TBF pilots were dead. Their gunners and radio men were dead. 18 men total from the Midway detachment, and from Hornet, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron was dead. Every pilot and crewman from his 15 TBDs was dead, except George Gay. VT-8 had been effectively annihilated. The squadron was reconstituted in July. New pilots, new aircraft, new crews. The rebuilt VT-8 was assigned to USS Saratoga and sent to the Solomon Islands. The Marines had landed on Guadalcanal in August. Japanese forces were counterattacking. The Navy needed every torpedo squadron in the Pacific. Earnest went with them. He'd survived Midway, but the war wasn't over. He was 25 years old with 3 months of combat experience. The Navy needed experienced pilots, men who'd seen action and lived. Men who knew how to survive. Earnest was now one of the most experienced torpedo bomber pilots in the Pacific Fleet. In September and October 1942, VT-8 flew missions from Saratoga and later from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Earnest flew strike missions against Japanese cruisers and destroyers. He bombed shore installations. He attacked transports. The aircraft were better. The tactics were better. The Avenger was proving itself as the best torpedo bomber in the war. But the missions were still dangerous. Japanese fighters were still faster. Anti-aircraft fire was still deadly. On September 16th, Earnest was part of a strike force that put a torpedo into a Japanese cruiser. On October 9th, he led a flight that bombed enemy positions at Cape Esperance. The missions added up. The risks added up. By November, the jungle and exhaustion had broken most of VT-8. The squadron was withdrawn and disbanded for the second time. Earnest had earned a 3rd Navy Cross, 3 in 6 months, but the question nobody could answer was how long his luck would hold. Earnest flew his last combat mission from Henderson Field on November 12, 1942, 6 months after Midway. The squadron had lost more pilots and crews at Guadalcanal, not as catastrophically as June 4th, but steadily. 1 plane lost here, 2 pilots killed there. The cumulative effect was the same. By November, VT-8 was exhausted. The survivors were rotated back to the United States. Earnest's combat record was extraordinary. 3 Navy Crosses, multiple strike missions, 0 aircraft lost under his command after Midway. He'd proven that June 4th wasn't luck. He was simply one of the best torpedo bomber pilots in the Navy. Calm under fire, excellent judgment, able to make decisions when everything was going wrong. Those were the qualities that kept pilots alive. The Navy recognized it. Instead of giving Earnest a desk job, they made him an instructor. New torpedo bomber pilots needed to learn from someone who'd survived, someone who could teach them what worked and what got you killed. Earnest spent 1943 training the next generation of naval aviators. He taught them how to approach a target, how to evade fighters, how to survive when your aircraft was damaged, how to fly on instruments that weren't there anymore. But Earnest didn't stay an instructor forever. The Navy needed experienced combat pilots for new missions. After the war in the Pacific ended in August 1945, Earnest remained in the Navy. He joined in 1941, expecting to serve a few years. But naval aviation was his career now. He was good at it. The Navy needed men like him. In the years after the war, Earnest flew different missions: hurricane reconnaissance, weather observation, search and rescue. The Navy was adapting to peacetime operations, but still needed skilled pilots. Earnest flew B-17s modified for hurricane hunting, flying into storms that would destroy most aircraft, reading weather patterns, saving lives by providing early warnings. It wasn't combat, but it was dangerous work that required the same skills: situational awareness, calm decision-making, ability to handle damaged aircraft. He was promoted steadily: lieutenant, lieutenant commander, commander, captain. Each promotion brought more responsibility. He commanded squadrons. He commanded air stations. In the 1960s, he was given command of Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia, one of the largest naval air stations on the East Coast. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of aircraft. The boy who'd flown a shot-up Avenger back to Midway was now responsible for an entire air station. Earnest retired from the Navy in 1973. 31 years of service. He'd seen the Navy transform from propeller-driven torpedo bombers to supersonic jets. From 1942, when America was losing the war, to 1973, when America had the most powerful Navy in the world. He'd been part of that transformation. After retirement, Earnest rarely spoke about Midway. Other veterans from the battle became famous. George Gay wrote a book and appeared on television. He was called the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Earnest and Ferrier joked that they were the other sole survivors. But Earnest didn't seek publicity. He'd done his duty. That was enough. The Battle of Midway remained the defining moment of his life. June 4th, 1942, the day he lost friends. The day he flew an aircraft that shouldn't have stayed airborne. The day he learned what he was capable of when everything was falling apart. Those 90 minutes from the Japanese fleet back to Midway had tested him in ways nothing else ever would. Historians later studied the battle. They analyzed every decision, every attack, every loss. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was recognized as crucial to the American victory. The 3 torpedo attacks pulled Japanese fighters out of position. They prevented the Japanese counterstrike. They created the window for dive bombers to attack unopposed. 45 men dead, but 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The turning point of the Pacific War. TBF Avenger Bureau number 00380 was eventually retired from service. The aircraft that had been first off the production line and survived 73 bullet holes was displayed in museums. A reminder of what could be survived with skill and determination. A reminder of the price paid at Midway. Harry Ferrier also made the Navy his career. The 17-year-old radioman who'd survived Midway continued flying combat missions through the rest of the war. He flew with VT-3 and later returned to VT-8 when the squadron was reconstituted again. He saw action in the Eastern Solomons and throughout the Pacific Campaign. He was commissioned as an ensign in 1945 and retired as a commander in 1970. 25 years of service. Like Earnest, he rarely sought attention for what happened on June 4th. The 2 men stayed in contact after the war. They understood something nobody else could. What it felt like to be the only survivors. What it meant to watch 5 aircraft explode in 3 minutes. what it took to fly 200 miles in a dying aircraft. They didn't need to talk about it often. They just knew. Over the decades, military historians became increasingly interested in the Battle of Midway. It was studied at the Naval War College, analyzed in staff colleges, written about in books and documentaries. The tactical decisions, the intelligence breakthrough that revealed Japanese plans, the timing that put American carriers in position, the luck that put dive bombers over the Japanese fleet at exactly the right moment, and always the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. VT-8 from Hornet and Midway, VT-6 from Enterprise, VT-3 from Yorktown. 51 torpedo bombers launched, 35 shot down, 89 men killed. Not a single torpedo hit. But the Japanese fighters were drawn down. The carriers were forced to maneuver. The counterstrike was delayed. The dive bombers arrived unopposed. Military analysts called it the most one-sided tactical exchange in naval aviation history. 89 men killed for 0 direct results. But strategically, it was decisive. Without those torpedo attacks, the dive bombers might have faced the full Japanese combat air patrol. The battle might have ended differently. The war might have lasted years longer. Earnest understood this better than most. He'd been there. He'd seen Fieberling go down. He'd seen the other 4 TBFs explode. He'd flown through the debris of aircraft that had been intact 30 seconds earlier. He knew the sacrifice wasn't wasted, but knowing didn't make it easier. In the 1990s and 2000s, Earnest occasionally attended Midway commemorations. He met younger naval aviators. They asked questions about the battle, about the TBF, about flying on trim tabs, about landing on one wheel. He answered them matter-of-factly. No dramatization, no embellishment. Just what happened. Some historians asked why he never wrote a book like George Gay did. Earnest's answer was simple. He'd done his job. That was all. Writing a book would have felt like seeking credit for something 45 other men paid for with their lives. He didn't want that. The TBF Avenger became one of the most successful naval aircraft of World War II. Over 9,000 built, used by the Navy and Marines throughout the Pacific. Reliable, tough, effective. The disaster at Midway was its combat debut, but not its legacy. The Avenger went on to sink dozens of Japanese ships and submarines. It proved the design was sound. The tactics just needed refinement. Bureau number 00380 became a symbol of that toughness. 73 hits and it flew home. Engineers who examined it at Pearl Harbor couldn't fully explain how. The elevator cables were severed, the hydraulics were destroyed. Fuel lines were punctured but sealed themselves. The Wright Cyclone engine had taken 7 hits but kept running. It should have been impossible. But impossible was a word that didn't apply on June 4, 1942. Impossible was staying in formation while 5 aircraft around you exploded. Impossible was flying 200 miles with no instruments. Impossible was landing on one wheel at 120 miles per hour. Earnest had done all of it in 90 minutes, and then spent the next 31 years serving quietly without expecting recognition. Albert Kyle Earnest died on October 27, 2009. He was 92 years old, 67 years after Midway. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, 3 Navy crosses, 31 years of service, one of the last survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8. Harry Ferrier outlived him by 7 years. He died in May 2016 at age 90, also buried with honors. The last 2 survivors of the Midway TBF detachment were gone, but what they represented remained. Courage under impossible circumstances, duty when survival seemed unlikely, the willingness to fly into hell because someone ordered you to, and because your country needed you to. The story of June 4, 1942, survived because people remembered. Veterans associations preserved records. Historians interviewed survivors. The Navy maintained documentation. Photographs of Bureau number 00380 were archived. The bullet-riddled TBF became evidence of what could be survived. Military aviation changed dramatically after World War II. Jet engines replaced propellers. Missiles replaced torpedoes. Carriers grew larger. Aircraft grew faster. But the fundamental lessons remained the same. Training matters. Discipline matters. Courage matters. The ability to function when everything is going wrong matters most of all. Young naval aviators in the 21st century still study the Battle of Midway. They analyze the tactical decisions, the communication failures, the coordination problems, why Hornet's air group flew the wrong heading, why torpedo squadrons attacked without fighter escort, why American torpedoes failed so often. The mistakes are studied so they won't be repeated. But they also study what went right. The intelligence breakthrough that revealed Japanese plans, the positioning of American carriers, the decision to launch strikes immediately despite incomplete information, the bravery of pilots who attacked knowing they probably wouldn't survive. Those decisions won the battle. Earnest's flight back to Midway is used as a case study in aviation survival. How he maintained control using only trim tabs, how he navigated without instruments, how he executed the emergency landing procedure perfectly despite catastrophic damage. Flight instructors use his example to teach student pilots what's possible when you don't panic. The 73 bullet holes are particularly instructive. They show where a TBF Avenger could take damage and keep flying. The engine could absorb multiple hits. The wings could be riddled and maintain lift. The tail could be shredded and still provide stability. But the elevator control cables were vulnerable. One good burst in the right place and the pilot lost pitch control. Earnest survived because he understood he could use trim tabs as backup controls. Most pilots wouldn't have thought of that. Most wouldn't have had the skill to execute it. Modern aircraft are more resilient. Redundant systems, backup controls, computer-assisted flight. But they're also more complex. More things can fail. Pilots still need the fundamental skills Earnest had: situational awareness, ability to improvise, calm decision-making under pressure. Those skills don't change regardless of technology. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 is commemorated every year on June 4th. Ceremonies at naval air stations, moments of silence, names read aloud. 45 men who died attacking the Japanese fleet, 3 who survived. The ratio tells the story better than any words. VT-8 received 2 presidential unit citations, one for Midway, one for Guadalcanal, the only squadron to receive that honor twice in World War II. The citations are displayed at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Next to them are photographs of the pilots. Young men, most in their 20s, some like Ferrier, still teenagers. They look confident in the photos, ready. They had no idea what was coming. Museums preserve the physical evidence, aircraft, uniforms, medals, photographs, but the real preservation happens when the story is told, when someone explains what happened on June 4th, why 6 TBF Avengers attacked without fighter cover, why 5 were shot down in 3 minutes, why the 6th flew 200 miles home on trim tabs alone, why it mattered. The story matters because it shows what human beings are capable of, not superheroes, not movie characters, real people. A 25-year-old pilot who'd never been in combat, a 17-year-old radio man who'd lied about his age to enlist, a 20-year-old gunner who died in his turret. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because their country needed them to. That's why the story survives, not because it's about technology or tactics, but because it's about people who faced impossible odds and refused to quit. People who watched their friends die and kept flying. People who flew damaged aircraft 200 miles because going down wasn't acceptable. People who sacrificed everything so others could live. Every generation needs to hear these stories, not to glorify war, but to understand what previous generations endured, what they sacrificed, what they made possible. The world we live in today exists because people like Earnest and Ferrier and Manning flew into hell on June 4th, 1942. Because they did their duty even when survival seemed impossible. Because they refused to fail even when failure seemed certain. The Japanese shot Albert Earnest's plane 73 times. They killed his gunner. They wounded his radio man. They destroyed his instruments. They severed his control cables. They should have killed him, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't tells us something important about human capability. It wasn't the aircraft that survived. Bureau number 00380 was a machine, metal and wires and fuel. It should have crashed into the Pacific. The Wright Cyclone engine should have seized after taking 7 hits. The airframe should have broken apart after absorbing 66 more. The laws of physics and engineering said the TBF shouldn't have made it back. But Earnest wasn't bound by those laws. He found a way. When his elevator controls failed, he used trim tabs. When his instruments died, he navigated by the sun. When his hydraulics were shot, he landed on one wheel. He adapted, he improvised, he refused to accept that survival was impossible. That's the lesson. Not that war is glorious, not that sacrifice is easy, but that human beings have the capacity to overcome impossible circumstances when they refuse to quit, when they stay calm, when they think clearly despite fear and pain and chaos, when they do their duty regardless of cost. Torpedo Squadron 8 paid a terrible price on June 4, 1942. 45 men killed, families destroyed, futures erased. Lieutenant Fieberling never saw his 33rd birthday. Jay Manning never came home to Washington. 14 other pilots from the Midway and Hornet detachments died that morning. Their sacrifice bought 6 minutes. 6 minutes when Japanese fighters were out of position. 6 minutes that let American dive bombers attack unopposed. 6 minutes that changed the war. Was it worth it? The men who died can't answer that question. The 3 who survived carried it for the rest of their lives. Earnest lived 67 years after Midway. Ferrier lived 74 years. They both served their country for decades. They both built families and careers. They both died old men. But June 4, 1942 never left them. The sound of Manning's gun going silent. The sight of 5 TBFs exploding. The 90 minutes flying home wondering if they'd make it. They made it. And because they did, we know the story. We know what happened at Midway. We know the price that was paid. We know what human beings are capable of when everything is falling apart. Modern naval aviators still study this mission. They analyze how Earnest maintained control, how he navigated without instruments, how he executed an emergency landing procedure under impossible conditions. His flight is taught at flight schools as an example of what can be survived with skill and determination. The lessons go beyond aviation. They apply to anyone facing impossible circumstances. Stay calm. Assess your options. Use whatever tools you have left. Improvise. Adapt. Never accept that failure is inevitable. Earnest had trim tabs. Most people have something. The question is whether you can recognize it and use it when everything else has failed. That's why this story matters 83 years later. Not because of the technology, not because of the tactics, but because it shows what one person can do when quitting isn't an option. When the aircraft is dying and the instruments are gone and you're 200 miles from safety, you find a way. Or you die trying. Albert Earnest found a way, and his story reminds us that we can too. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with trim tabs and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Albert Earnest doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.